Eskow, R.J. Eskow, and we're going to start off by talking about a very common sense proposal from the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And the thing about common sense proposals in Washington, D.C. is that they don't get a lot of press nowadays. So we want to try to rectify that in our own little way by talking about the proposal from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the CPC, and with us to talk about it is an analyst from the Economic Policy Institute, EPI, who regular listeners know we rely on for a lot of our analysis. And our guest today from the EPI is Joshua Smith. And Joshua joined that group last November with a focus on federal tax and budget policy, which is where all the action is nowadays in Washington, D.C. And before that, he was at New America Foundation, and he's working for a master's in public policy from UC California, Berkeley. Thanks for being with us, Josh.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, listen, when I was in Berkeley, that MPP program in public policy was really hard to get into. It was a really great program and pretty competitive. Was it hard? Before we go to the CPC budget, did you have a tough time getting in, or were you just such an ace that it was easy?
Well, the funny thing is they don't tell you. So I guess I'll never know.
All right. Well, good on you for that, as we say. Listen, and you did a great analysis of the CPC budget, which for some reason isn't getting much traction. And I want to go over, press-wise, that is, but they are going to vote on it, I'm told. And I think everybody listening, by the end of this discussion, may want to press their representatives to support it. Now, tell us a couple of the key provisions of what they call the better off budget.
That's exactly right. So some of the key provisions are things that I'm sure that your listeners are familiar with, that think tanks and members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and others have been angling for a long time now. So on the tax side, it would ask people to pay their fair share and increase some brand new tax brackets for millionaires and billionaires. It would cap the value of itemized deductions. It would end exclusion of foreign earned income. It would close a lot of corporate loopholes. It would institute a tax on carbon, which is desperately needed. It would also, and I think this is showing that the Congressional Progressive Caucus is taking ideas anywhere they can get them. They actually use an idea from Congressman Dave Camp's tax reform proposal to increase an excise tax on systemically important financial institutions. And on the spending side, again, it takes ideas anywhere they can find them, and it follows President Obama's lead to expand the earned income tax credit. It invests very heavily in job creation measures. In fact, just over the first 3 calendar years of the budget, there would be $940 billion in job creation. Over the 11 years, it's $820 billion just in physical infrastructure. Really, on the spending side, the idea of the Congressional Progressive Caucus is to start get government spending enough to close the output gap. That's the gap between potential GDP and actual GDP, and increase job creation. And our analysis shows that at the height of this stimulus boost over the first couple of years, at the height of it, GDP would increase by 3.8%. Employment would increase by 4.6 million, and the unemployment rate would drop to somewhere between 4.9% and 5.3%, which is in line with what the Congressional Budget Office thinks is full employment. So that's just sort of a broad overview of what the CPC is doing with its better off budget.
And to put it in context a little bit, for one thing, sometime in the mid or early 60s, I believe it was, the definition of full employment was revised from 4% upward to 5%. So this is not by any means a stretch goal, historically speaking, in terms of the United States. And I would add to that I would assume the logic behind front-loading the job creation and the expenditure in the first 3 or 4 years is to dig us out of this deep hole we're in terms of unemployment. Is that right?
That's exactly right, and this is what we helped the CPC with, was determining exactly how much spending and how much revenue is needed, to fill that output gap. Every dollar of spending, it depends exactly what it's being spent for, but returns more than $1 to the economy. So take infrastructure investments, for instance. If the government spends $1, it actually increases GDP by $1.40, because that dollar, it hires somebody who has to in turn buy a sandwich, and then, the sandwich seller has to hire an assistant sandwich maker. So government spending, especially in this down economy with a severe lack of demand and a lot of slack in the labor market, it really will help fill that output gap, and that's what this budget is angling for.
And part of what you're talking about here, just so that our audience understands, is that there's something called the multiplier effect, right?
That's exactly right.
So the multiplier effect is when you put $1 into government spending, how much does that add to the overall economy? And in times like these, when employment is tough, when times are tough, wages are tough, that's pretty high. So in other words, this front loading of expenditure is a pretty good investment in the future. And I think that's something that people need to understand. I think that while the president, I believe, asked for $302 billion in infrastructure spending, they asked for more than $800 billion over 11 years, you said, right?
That's exactly right.
So now, and the American Society of Civil Engineers estimates the total amount of infrastructure repair that's needed in the next 10 years at somewhere in the order of $3.6 trillion. So with that in mind, I mean, one of the things I want to emphasize and I wanted to ask you about is that actually, while this is going to be, if it's covered at all, somewhat dismissed patronizingly by the media as somehow the left budget, to me, this actually feels like a pretty moderate and almost centrist budget, because here you've got massive unemployment, and they're talking about fairly restrained spending. You've got a $3+ trillion infrastructure problem. They're talking about spending less than $1 trillion over 11 years. They're talking about strengthening social insurance, which is good, but it's not by any means a radical. In fact, it's great, but it's not a radical transformation of the social safety net. And they emphasize that they're going to reduce the deficit even more than the Democrats or the leading, the president and the Republicans would, which I might even argue they devote too much energy to. So I don't know if you agree with me, but what are your thoughts? I think they're fairly conservative almost, or certainly centrist budget document.
I think some of the estimates are indeed sort of small c conservative, and I think that stems a lot with how the Congressional Budget Office has been projecting what they call potential GDP. They've revised it downward year after year after year. So the spending that it'll take to close the output gap that I was talking about, just it seems that it's been decreasing from year to year. So there's actually less stimulus spending in this budget than in the CPC's budgets in the past, and that's just because our aim is to fill the output gap, what CBO defines as the output gap. But there's reason to think that their downward revisions of potential GDP may be revising things downward too far. But to your broader point, just to talk about how this really isn't at all out of the political or policy mainstream, over 10 years on average, revenue would go up 2.94% in this budget compared to what it would be otherwise, and spending up 1.12% over what it would be otherwise. So really, it's not that much of a difference. In 2024, this budget shows that revenue would be 21.5% of GDP. That's certainly higher than it is today, but it's not some kind of historic outlier. In the year 2000, it was actually about 19.9%. So again, these aren't really outside of the mainstream at all. It's just sort of a correction, and it shows, how far our politics have sort of tilted to the right, and how far, every extra dollar of spending is looked askance at by Congress, by members of both parties. So really, this is outside of the historic mainstream, outside of the policy mainstream, and in some respects, like you were talking about, it does hew to some small c conservative ideas. That's exactly right.
Well, and it is, thanks for that clear explanation. And this speaks to me to one of the issues that I think, first of all, one of the reasons why everybody should urge their representatives with no question to vote about it, because this is such a mainstream and reasonable document. But a couple, you mentioned that it shows how our political dialogue has skewed so far to the right, and that's exactly right. Now, I make no apologies for the fact that I'm a leftist. That's who I am. Like it or not, the data and the analyses that I perform suggest to me left-leaning solutions are the best. Now, I wish the leftmost parameter or limit of the dialogue was a lot lot further to the left, frankly, than this budget. But given what's going on in Washington today, this should be the Democratic Party budget, and this should be the budget, in my opinion, that everybody gets on board with. This should be the compromise budget once the Democrats and Republicans get together. It, according to your own analysis, it reduces the debt to GDP ratio to 65.5% of GDP by 2024. I think that's buying into and certainly appeasing the deficit rhetoric and concerns of the right. So am I missing something?
No, I don't think you're missing something at all. I think that the deficit and debt note is an interesting one. It wasn't necessarily a goal of the CPC to reduce the debt to GDP ratio as much as they did, but more of a side effect of the policies that were involved. You know, if they followed the roadmap of boosting spending as much as they want to, and then boosting revenue as much as CPC wants to, that's the net effect. Is that the deficit really does come down pretty quickly, and perhaps you're right. Maybe it's quicker than it even needs to be. I read an interview with Dean Baker where he made the exact same point. So on one hand, that wasn't necessarily CPC's mission to reduce the deficit and bring down the debt, but it certainly is part of this budget, and that's 100% right.
Okay, so where do we go from here? I think this is a good document. I think your analysis of it is terrific. What's the one sentence kind of elevator pitch that people should have in their heads when they call their representatives, which I certainly hope they do, to support this document?
Yeah, I think the thing that they should tell their representatives is that we want a government whose priority it is to return the economy to full employment, and by voting for this budget, the better off budget, that's what government's aim will be.
All right. Well, that's great. Well, Josh Smith from the Economic Policy Institute, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, RJ.
And I'm just going to conclude by saying to the audience out there, call your representative, tell them you want a budget with these priorities, you want this budget, tell them this is not leftist, this is not extreme, this is mainstream, this is middle of the road, this is meeting the concerns of everyone, including the deficit crowd, so vote for it today. Do that while we go to break, and I'll expect a full report from you when we come back after this. I'm RJ Eskow. Thanks for being with us. We'll be right back.